Hello. सबैजनालाई स्वागत छ. Good afternoon. So this is supposed to be a very fiery session. I don't know we'll be able to live up to it or not. So I'd like to welcome everyone here, Sabrina, Paneer, and Kanak sir. Um, so this year we've been talking, usually journalists, we tend to tell others' story, but in the past 2 years or 3 years, we've been talking a lot about our own profession, about our craft, and the future of it. So I'd like to start the session by asking all the panelists here to tell us very briefly about what you think when you think about journalism under fire in the respective countries where you work from or are from.
Hello, is this on? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Hi everyone. So I'm a journalist based in Lahore, Pakistan, and I'm just going to speak briefly about the situation in Pakistan. Pakistan has never historically been an easy place for a journalist, and in particular, I work as a freelance journalist, which means that I work without any institutional protections. But at the same time, it's debatable whether or not under Prime Minister Imran Khan, the situation has improved or it's gotten worse. In one sense, a lot of journalists have said that it's gotten worse, because the majority of ad revenue going to media platforms in Pakistan are coming from the government, as well as subsidies from the government. So what we've seen is that the Pakistani government has actually had a lot of outstanding payments that it has not paid to media companies. So this is one of the more insidious forms of censorship, if you want to call it that, because in some sense, the easiest way to muffle journalism in Pakistan is by not paying journalists. If you rob them of their livelihood, then they cannot really speak. So this has been one of the greatest challenges for Pakistani journalists right now, just getting paid. Recently, there's been mass layoffs in Pakistani newsrooms, journalists not receiving their salary, but also being notified very arbitrarily and very randomly that their job no longer exists.
See, a decade ago when the Western media was going through the crisis, Indian newspaper owners and editors were, what can I say, came up with this brave face. In fact, one of them to a Van Ifra conference and he said that newspaper industry is like the sun. It rises in the east and it sets in the west. And this was the type of rhetoric with which they could come up earlier. But since 2014, one thing which is very clear is that during emergency, people say that it was the government which asked us, the media, to climb down, but media decided to crawl. But now it is a different question. Nobody is asking, but people are doing it on their own. Therefore, the amount of voluntary submission is a disturbing one. And that's the first issue which is striking. And the second issue is nobody, to be really clear, nobody is able to understand what this digital disruption actually means. Digital disruption means actually you have reach, there is no revenue. And when there is no revenue, you don't know what to do with it. And everybody is coming up with a kite flying idea by the day, and that kite flying idea dies by the next day. There was a video pivot, and then there was a podcast pivot, and then all sorts of ideas have come up, but nothing seems to be really working. Therefore, we don't know. One thing what we know is that 100-year-old model is under severe strain, and what is going to replace it, we don't know.
Since I regard myself as a Nepali journalist, but also a South Asian journalist, let me talk on wearing both hats. As far as Nepal is concerned, we achieved democratic freedom, fundamental freedoms, with the November 1990 Constitution. The very fact that that Constitution is not even remembered today for what it gave us, that is open society, indicates that our ability to protect our freedoms is rather weak. Things have come to us, some would say rather easily, to the extent that perhaps we don't understand the dangers in front of us. And in particular today, as a government in power that is nominally called the Communist Party of Nepal, within which there is a formerly democratizing force, the UML, and opportunistic force that has refused to acknowledge its own faults and failures, that is the Maoist Party. Given that that is the combine that rules today, it behooves us to watch and be very careful to watchdog our own society, because some of the indications are not very heartening. We can go back to that later. Now, if we have time. Now, looking at the South Asian terrain, specifically looking at each country, you have Pakistan where military intelligence can whisk you off at any point. You look at Bangladesh, I'm just taking pinpoints to speak of a larger malaise. Bangladesh, our friend, I think all of us know him well, and some in the audience as well, Shahidul Alam, a photographer and a cultural activist, was put away by Sheikh Hasina, who is coming up for elections on December 30. You can expect, even in the week that's left before the elections, much attacks on media, including attempts to control digital media. But if she wins, as is expected, through a lot of hera-feri in election time, then you can expect Bangladesh to do very poorly. Sri Lanka has its own history with the conflict which led to enormous stress among journalists. Suddenly, with the rise of Rajapaksa, things had looked bad. But again, things are looking a little better. But you can see Sri Lanka is a very rocky boat. As far as India is concerned, if I might suggest that it is the country as the most, what we consider to be the strongest democracy. And the rest of us used to look up to India. But in the age of Narendra Modi, India is also full of, as Paneer suggested before me, full of self-censorship. And when Himal magazine organized a workshop at the India International Center a year and a half ago, and the title was Digital Media in the Age of Demagoguery. And by demagoguery, we meant the demagoguery of the BJP RSS combined. I can tell you, none of the participants referred to Narendra Modi by name, which is indicative of how far this fear of the state has come across. I'll just end by the point, buttressing the point Paneer made, as while we still have to have the challenge of keeping open society, the carpet has been pulled from under the media because of the arrival of digital media, online media, to the extent that today I fear that at least in Nepal, there may come a time, or there may already, may already have arrived at the time where social media, with its trolls, with its populism, is directing mass media rather than mass media helping create public opinion. So I feel that we are in a very vulnerable time.
Thank you for touching up on social media and also talking about the South Asian terrain. I was just looking up at Committee to Protect Journalists' recent impunity index, and unfortunately, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan is high up on the list. So I wanted to go back to the point you said about social media, and based on what we were talking last evening, when we talk about misinformation, we tend to talk about the external forces. We don't talk about mainstream media and how they might be in certain ways. Like in India right now, you see, like you said, a lot of them bowing down despite everyone telling them not to do so. How would you see in Pakistan and in India where certain newsrooms maybe because they're pushing certain agendas, are sort of peddling the lies that we see on social media and giving them like a larger platform through the, whether it's through the 9 p.m. primetime debate shows or other programs.
Well, certainly social media has allowed the democratization of information, and I think in one sense that's definitely been beneficial. In Pakistan, you'll actually see our own government. Prime Minister Imran Khan's government has come out explicitly saying that we need to fight misinformation, taking a cue from Donald Trump, for example. So actually, the Ministry of Information in Pakistan, they started their own Twitter account, basically fact-checking the news, and basically any time that they detect fake news, they will be the watchdog informing the public of the newsmakers basically making errors. And I think for the government itself to attempt to discredit the news this way is extremely dangerous, particularly in a country like Pakistan, where it's very difficult to report the news and to disseminate the news to the people who most need to read it. So certainly social media is a very interesting component of how people are receiving the news today, but it's also like, for example, in Pakistan, the government wants to create a body to regulate social media in addition to the broadcast media, in addition to the print media. And it's not quite clear if this would actually benefit journalists, if it would help the public, for example, in getting information, because it's not really clear what the government wants to do. It just seems like one more step to control the narrative.
See, my problem is it's very easy to blame social media. But two studies which I've done with enormous empirical evidence were in the UK and in the US. One was on the impact of social media on Brexit. Another was on the impact of social media on President Trump's election. When you actually look at the details, what emerges is that the role of Sun or the role of Mail or the role of the tabloid media in UK contributed so much, and most of the things what you later saw in the social media actually came from this mainstream partisan media. The role of Fox in the US election. Can we now say that, can we put Fox into a social media, or can we put a Republic TV in India into a social media? And also the changing ownership pattern. This is what is most disturbing. For instance, after 2010, nearly 80,000 crore rupees have come into Indian media. Of this 80,000 crore rupees, earlier media support used to come in the form of advertisement or support or sponsorship. But this has come in the form of stakes and ownership. Reliance has become the largest media organization in this country. We have Brillas who have taken over stake in India Today group. Therefore, what is happening is the money which is coming into media is coming in as ownership stake. This is another issue about which we have to be very clear. And this also ties up with one more question of blatantly partisan ownership in television. Earlier it was easier to have a broad ideological differences, but now it is different. If you take something like Republic Television, it's owned by a person called Rajiv Chandrasekhar, who also happens to be the parliamentary panel member looking after the defense ministry. Which means, what do you expect from the channel for something like, say, a Rafale deal? This conflict of ownership is the one which is taking a dangerous edge right now.
Okay. Panneer, if you could just, because a lot of things that we consume about Indian media comes from the English language channels or the Hindi language channels that's mostly based in North India, but how is the conversation around these things, like the way media covers whatever is happening in Indian politics, differ in the media that might be based in southern states of India?
See, till at least 2010, India is known for its plurality of media. After this big money coming into media, what we see is a proliferation of media rather than plurality of media. In fact, if you look at the way the Reliance have picked up the stakes in not only in the IBN but also in eNadu, which means there's a consolidation of North Indian and South Indian channels. The amount of consolidation which is taking place now is a different one. This type of concentration of ownership we did not witness earlier. And India does not have any rule which bars cross-media ownership. And cross-media ownership is there. Therefore, what we are witnessing is a sort of a concentration of ownership pattern. And I don't know where this is going to lead.
I just want to change the conversation a little bit and talk to Sabrina because she's one of the few reporters who's been consistently reporting out of Pakistan. And because we're talking about journalism under fire, under threat, how has that changed the way stories from South Asia, Pakistan, because of your experience, has changed when you pitch editors in the US or the UK?
Just as a clarification, I work in Pakistan, but I'm predominantly writing for North American publications. So, one, with the ascent of Donald Trump, most of the resources in the US in newsrooms is directed toward covering the Trump presidency. And I would say the level of interest in Pakistan or South Asia in general has really plummeted. Although for Pakistan in particular, it's actually extremely challenging to get people to pay attention outside of one or two episodes that will appear on the news, like a bombing, for example. But then you only have 24 hours to cover that story, so you have to snatch it really quickly, or an election story, for example. But the long-term problems that continue to haunt Pakistan, those are the hardest stories to actually cover. Like the systemic problems in Pakistan, those really are very difficult to cover outside of Pakistan for a non-Pakistani audience. But I think if a story gets written first in English, because the English language media is very different from the Urdu language media, it can be actually beneficial, for example, to introduce a topic that isn't being introduced in the Urdu language media. To introduce it first in the English language media allows the Urdu language media to actually cover it sometimes. So the question we can ask is, if international news is not really looking at Pakistan nowadays, what stories are not being introduced even to the Urdu language media because it's not even being written in the English language media?
I might have raised this matter yesterday as well when I had the mic. When I have gone around India in particular, also Bangladesh, and talking about media, I always pick up the subject of Pakistan. Because what do we in Nepal or Bangladesh or India, what do we know about Pakistan and Pakistan's people? We know it either from international media, and we already heard about that, or we hear it from Indian media. We're not watching ZTV, we're not watching Geo TV, for example, or the other channels of Pakistan. We're not following Dawn, we're not following the news, and we cannot read the Urdu papers. So we're following Indian Hindi channels or Indian English media. And when you look at the Hindi channels, you know how it is. There are 15 people talking at the same time, and often they bring a token Pakistani, and they apparently pay him very well just so that he can be lambasted, hit over the head by all the others combined. So we've been watching this charade, this incredibly unfair coverage of Pakistan, and essentially by not distinguishing the Pakistani state and the Pakistani people. And if you go by per capita impact of bombings, terror bombings, military intelligence activities, all kinds of militancies, and people coming into schools and killing hundreds of children, as they did in Islamabad, Rawalpindi, Peshawar, sorry. I think per capita, the people of Pakistan are suffering much more than anybody else. But do we in Nepal feel it? Do they in Bangladesh feel it? No, that is because we are essentially primed by the news that we receive from Indian media and international. So I believe that in Nepal, at least, we must self-correct as consumers of news on how Pakistan is presented to us, and firstly have a little bit of humility to look at our own society and its weaknesses, and also to be able to be more analytical about who's feeding us the information.
Since you touched on an issue about looking inward, and Panneer talked about a little bit about the money coming into the media, and you talked about a lot of layoffs happening in Pakistani newsroom, how do you see the conversation happening around media ethics practices, and whether or not all this money, big money coming into newsroom is actually helping strengthen the abilities of journalists, how much investments is being made on journalists that you see around yourselves?
See, the most disturbing element is that there is no more investment on domain expertise within newsrooms. The last macroeconomic editor of a newspaper was C. Ram Manohar Reddy, who was the economic editor of the Hindu, my newspaper. Ram Reddy left Hindu to become the editor of EPW way back in 2004. After Ram Reddy left, we don't have an economic editor. After CRL Narasimhan's resignation, we don't have a banking editor. What is happening is that we are outsourcing our talents. The way if anything has to do with the neighboring countries, get hold of a former ambassador. If you need to talk about strategic affairs, get hold of a former general. If you want to talk about what is happening in banking, get hold of a former banking chairperson. Therefore, what is happening is we are not investing in domain expertise in these subjects. Earlier, I remember when the economic survey used to be embargoed and reaching the newspaper office, some of the economic writers could actually go through it quickly and come up with fresh observation about this economic survey, which was so sharp. Now even reading the economic survey has been outsourced. Therefore, it has been embargoed at 5:30 by X agency. Sorry. And by 6:30, you have some other people who have been designated to give the opinion. Therefore, you have your CIA, or the Confederation of Indian Industry opinion, and therefore what is happening is if you are going to evacuate domain expertise within the newsroom and to expect the newspapers to provide a democratic adversarial role, that's going to be difficult.
Nothing
Okay.
on that.
Okay. Thanks. Kanak, so do you have anything to add on that? Okay. I think Pani raised a very important issue, which brings me to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is about access journalism, which is mostly because newsrooms are not investing enough in the people within the newsroom, so you're always reaching out to people, whether it's in the army or foreign services. How has that shifted journalistic ethics in India or Pakistan because of the growth of, let's say, access journalism?
See, we have been trained to believe that journalism differs from other forms of communication because the emphasis of journalism lies in the act of verification. Now, if the act of verification itself is going to become extremely difficult, that is, if the official sources are going to tell a lie, this I have to be very clear because I have to talk about something called the India's GDP series. India's GDP series have been revised so much with the back series because they wanted to come up with a data to say that under Manmohan Singh, India did not perform well as it's doing under Mr. Modi. Therefore, what happened is this entire back series and the way the base year has been changed and the number has been manipulated, which means the lie is coming from the top. Therefore, where are you going to go and verify? Therefore, the act of verification has become extremely difficult. Therefore, the part of the access journalism is also the system has been so polluted. You don't know which is the wellspring from which you can take the water.
What is the case in Pakistan when it comes to access journalism?
Well, just to go off on a slightly different point, I think in all of these South Asian countries, there's a crisis of data. Like, for example, when I was doing a story on air pollution in Lahore, it was extremely difficult to get information from the government about the PM 2.5 or the pollution levels in the city. And one, I think this is very common among all of the South Asian countries, not just like in terms of air quality data, but also in terms of health data or other things, wherever the government may not necessarily think it's in their interest to share that information, they'll just say like, oh, it's somewhere in the files, we don't have it yet, or it's like, it's in the computer system, we can't get it yet, whatever. So in Lahore, actually, we were able to use the legal system to draw out some of that information, but as a journalist working under like a very strict deadline, you don't have months to wait for, you know, the high court to actually basically ask the government to release that data. So I think this is one of the main impediments for a journalist, particularly a freelance journalist, when you're investing your own resources in the reporting. How do you verify information? How do you actually amass and collect that information? And two, how do you get that information to readers? And I would be really curious about how the situation is in India and Nepal in terms of getting accurate information and numbers and, you know, using that to bolster and strengthen the actual reporting. Because that's been, for me as a reporter, like one of the great challenges. Like, you can speak to 1 million people, but if the government's not willing to speak to you, sometimes you literally lack like the most important vital information for your story.
India is a country where it did not have a chief statistician for 9 months. Therefore, you can understand how government is scared of putting out data in public domain.
Nepal is a chaotic country where the government doesn't know whether it's coming or going. As a result, there is no insidious attempt to keep information out of the public's hand. Nepal is, in that sense, not an autocratic country. But the question is there any information out there to share? And that is the problem. There is not even information at the source that is credible. And so the issue for now is not so much that there is a government that is trying to keep you out. In fact, I think there are many issues where Nepal needs data at a cross-border level, because so much of Nepal, as a relatively thin country that goes across the Himalaya down to the plains, has a lot of its economy being shaped by climate change, to cross-border pollution, to cross-border other kinds of transactions. So I would say that Nepal, if you've looked at the river data, for example, the Chinese and the Indians are both extremely cagey about sharing river data. But Nepal is not. But then what data does Nepal have? I think the problem in Nepal, as long as I have the mic, is that the reportage overall, in relative terms, is okay. The weakness in Nepali journalism on the whole is opinion columns. The opinion columns, when you come to opinion columns, almost like we fall flat. Because the depth of backgrounding, the lack of ab initio bias, that is not there. So if you read enough newspapers, at least from the reporting, you can more or less know where things are. But that does not hold for opinions. But this is going slightly out of topic, so I give the mic back to you.
I'd like to give the mic to some of our audience members here, if you have any questions, before we move on to other questions.
एउटा कुरा म भनिहालौँ, because अहिलेको हाम्रो विषय चाहिँ नि प्रेस फ्रिडम हो, हामी नेपालमा छौँ. नेपालमा अहिले के भइरहेछ भन्ने कुरा, if you will forgive for speaking in Nepali briefly, हामीले त्यतापट्टि पनि ध्यान दिनुपर्छ जस्तो लाग्छ मलाई. आजको सेसन अन्तर्गत नेपालमा अकर्मण्यता हो कि योजनाबद्ध हिसाबले हो, तर नेपालको प्रेस टेरेन चाहिँ नि खुम्चिँदै गएको देखिन्छ. एकातर्फ प्रेस आफै कमजोर हुँदैछ, ओपिनियन कलममा त म त भन्छु एकदमै कमजोर, रिपोर्टाजमा ठिक छ, तर फेरि पत्रकारितालाई चाहिँ नि विज्ञापनले मात्रै नधान्ने, उतापट्टि सोसियल मिडियाले कमजोर बनाइरहेछ. न्यू इकोनोमिक्स जो पनीरले भन्नुभयो त्यो अनुसार चाहिँ नि मिडियाको इकोनोमिक्स डामाडोल भइरहेछ एकापट्टि. अर्कोपट्टि चाहिँ नि नाउ आई विल जस्ट स्पिक इन इङ्ग्लिस नाउ. देयर इज अ सिचुएसन वेयर while the economics of media is being turned on its head and we still don't know where to find ourselves. Our opinion columns are weak because we don't have liberal arts education to begin with. There are of course always exceptions. The reportage is relatively good, but the media houses are many of the media houses don't survive out of income from media. They are being either prestige media houses by individuals who happen to have their earnings elsewhere. So they are not making money off media, off readership, where at least you have then that loyalty towards the readership. So given that situation, now from the top comes a situation where there is a move towards, I will not use the word throttling media, but certainly weakening media. The only thing I have not been able to pinpoint right now is whether it is organized and a planned intrusion or whether it is just an act of fecklessness. But the reality is that the current government, I still do not use the term regime, the current government is made up of former Maoist rebels and a democratized left party who have joined together. The result of that is a situation where both on the platform of non-governmental efforts as well as in media and through the various provinces, there's been an attempt to control photographers are jailed for taking photographs of buildings of state personages. Journalists are handcuffed for minor misdemeanors. Facebook postings are leading to immediate jailing rather than cases being filed. So if you look across the terrain, there is something amiss. Only point is this planned or is this a result of fecklessness? I believe that those of us who are in media in Nepal must watch all these things and put them on a graph to see and to decide for ourselves how bad it is, and then to work hard to push back these attacks that media is facing.
Yeah, but we've seen the same thing that Kanak sir just mentioned happening in India and also in Pakistan. But what I find interesting in India is now there's this alternative space where people who are not necessarily journalists are calling out that the government's doing. Like there might be a parody page or some website or like fact-checking sites that's coming up. Has there anything that you've seen that comes to your mind about these alternative spaces that is sort of telling what the media might be misleading the readers towards, or government's actions on journalists? Or
See, there are lots of small initiatives which are happening, starting from alt news to Factly to, and even websites like Wire or Scroll. Given the size of India, these interventions are very, very small. That's what we have to keep in mind. And the reach of the mainstream is so big. For instance, some of the Hindi papers are selling about 4 million copies. Therefore, if you're going to have 3 major Hindi dailies which are selling about 4 million copies each, and then to say that one alt news broke this fake news. Now this alt news breaking the fake news reaches such a minuscule population. What happens is we tend to inflate the power of cyberspace. Cyberspace is not a public space, but cyberspace has become a silos. Cyberspace gives people who are of same ideas to come together, and it doesn't permit a conversation. What is happening with cyberspaces, I call it as a concurrent monologues. The way what you are seeing is quite a lot of concurrent monologues which are taking place. We need somebody who can break the silos and have some sort of a dialogue, and to also hold somebody else accountable. How are we going to hold somebody accountable when others are not even reading you? Therefore, that's a much bigger question for which I don't have an answer. If you are talking about the initiative, yes, initiatives are there. Are they enough? No, they are not enough.
Do we have some questions from the audience? The gentleman there in green.
From the discussion so far, we seem to be all agreed on the fact that we all share the same liberal bias. We agreed on the fact that what we call accountability journalism is on a slippery slope in terms of both the money being taken out of the business, and we also agreed on the fact that most accountability media houses or media products don't earn enough money to be able to sustain its independence in a constantly conflicted world. Given these truths, and as Paneer said, alt media, internet is also a kind of more creates more segregated spaces rather than really plural spaces. So I'm talking to people like me. So where again the idea doesn't quite travel. So in that sense of the term, what happens is that, like Mark Twain said, the truth is still putting on his shoes while the lie is halfway across the globe. That instinct has been practically boosted, given a booster shot by the internet. It also, I think, I don't know, I would like the panel to talk about that. Is it also a consequence of this, what we call democratizing, which there seems to be extraordinary agreement that the internet democratizes the public space. But the other side of the story is, like you said, alt news might not change, might not change the perception of a majority of newspaper readers. But what it does is might be we are probably a little too optimistic about what it is achieving. The trouble might be that this internet kind of quick feed of news lowers the bar, and that allows more people to enter. You know, it's like people saying nowadays everybody is a poet. It's something similar to that. So is it a question of democracy being purely numerical, in which case naturally the majoritarianism will prevail, isn't it? I don't know.
I go back to my the earlier point, Harish, that I fear, at least in Nepal, that there may be creeping takeover of media by social media. All right? That, which means that when editors start looking at how many likes do I get in this point of view, how many trolls do I get with that point of view, and I start psychologically being impacted. I feel that that is a real problem. And the other one, I think, is a well-known fact that when you start sharing news and information, and when opinions are created on social media and spread like wildfire on social media, one thing that is missing is the editorial function. And I think that is it's still a work in progress, and I don't know how we tackle this, but it's a crazy situation, not only in Nepal and South Asia, across the world. We are tackling these matters at exactly the same time, because it used to be that media arrived, or any new technology arrived here in Nepal, let us say a decade or two after it was, protocols were already established in the West or in another society. Here the protocols have to be defined across the world at the same time. So each of us have to try and find our own answers. Let us say within the context of South Asia, or even more specifically in Nepal, I can only put this as a challenge. I do not have an answer. Editors are being supplanted by trolls, number one. Number two, what do we do about it? I don't know yet.
See, the disturbing element is trend has replaced the news editor. Therefore, if something is trending in your social media, that becomes your news list. This news list comes from either the scroll running at the bottom of the television screens, or your Twitter feed, or your Facebook feed. If your news editor is going to be driven by the metrics, it is a different reality what we are witnessing, first part. Second part, which is much more difficult to understand, but which has come to stay, is that earlier, every publication managed to balance public interest and what public is interested in. It doesn't mean that public was never interested in only in public interest stories. But there was this balance between public interest and what public is interested in. By permitting what only public is interested in, we are absolving our public interest role. And that is a disturbing one. We can't use a word democratizing for absolving our responsibility. I think we have to be very clear about it, because Uh, public, what public is interested in is manifested with the tabloid press throughout the world. Tabloid press is about 200 years old. Therefore, it's not new, but we always balanced it. And if you're not going to do that balancing, I think we are absolving our responsibility. And to call it democratizing, I think it's a easy way to run away from our own responsibilities.
अरू केही प्रश्न छन्? Okay.
My question is to Paneer sir. Do you sometimes feel as a media person that the Indian media field is just driven by highest rate, earning highest rate of TRP? Because sometimes when I see Indian televisions and when I see Indian news, instead of covering the main detailed research, they just keep on, showing all the senseless news just for the TRP. So how do you feel as a media person that Indian media is just, driven by TRP?
See, I have this problem about this word called Indian media itself, because it's such a huge variety of things which is there. From your Republic TV to India TV on one end, to EPW on the other end. It's a big range. Therefore, I don't use the word called Indian media to understand. I use a word called responsible media versus tabloid media. And unfortunately, tabloid media dominates, and tabloid media also has political patronage right now. The key issue is that if you're not a tabloid media, what is happening? Do people talk? We have a prime minister who hasn't given a single interview, exclusive interview to a newspaper, which is not willing to carry, which was given to him as a written copy. There's no interaction. Therefore, you're also working in an environment which is slightly difficult. Therefore, we don't know where we are heading.
My name is C.B. Gurung. My question is to Panneer sir. The title of today's discussion is Journalism on Fire. What I experienced, Pakistan, Afghanistan, it is very much disturbed by the terrorism. And today's discussion, you have not discussed about the situation of terrorism in South Asia and how they are operating and how the journalists are affected. For example, Afghanistan is SAARC country also. We are the member of, Afghanistan is the member of SAARC country. But there is fighting, sometime Mujahideen, last time Taliban came in power in 1996 to 2000 and 2001 after the demolition of Twin Tower. The military march, the United Force, United Nations and other ISIF, they march and the government is toppled. So in this situation, how our journalists are safe in those areas, and due to this reason, I think that the fact also is not coming, not even exposing. So this is my question, because you are the panelists, you have not touched any line on terrorism. This is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Paneer, Kanak sir.
So, the fact that there is not a single Indian journalist working in Pakistan, or there's not a single Pakistani journalist in India, speaks volume about this issue, because it is also partly governed by the visa regime. And the visa regime doesn't permit journalists to visit each other country easily. This is with reference to Pakistan. With reference to Afghanistan, The international agency's report is what the entire South Asia is dependent. We don't have a correspondent for any of the major Indian publications in Kabul. In fact, Indian foreign bureaus have come down. When I became a journalist, the newspaper for which I work, called the Hindu, used to have 18 foreign correspondents, and today we have 6. Because it's also expensive. Therefore, where do you cut your costs? You cut your costs first with your foreign bureau. Now we have only 6, from 18 to 6. We had a correspondent in Tokyo from 1945. We don't have a correspondent there. We don't have a correspondent in Pakistan, where of course we want to send a correspondent, he's yet to get a visa cleared. But there is a reduction in the international coverage. There is a certain amount of inward looking which is taking place. These are all disturbing reality. What you are pointing out is true, but that's also part of the political economy that is governing our mainstream media.
And I
Yeah,
just want to
Sabrina.
add one thing. Thank you for your question. First of all, Afghanistan was the deadliest country for journalists in the world this year, so it is very important to bring attention to the fact that so many journalists are being killed there. But it's also tied into, one, the Trump presidency. For example, most Americans are not aware that there is still a war in Afghanistan. It only comes in the news when, for example, Trump raises the possibility of withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. Then suddenly the Americans are aware again that they have a presence in Afghanistan. But yes, it's incumbent upon all journalists to acknowledge the death toll of journalists in Afghanistan, and I think all of the South Asian countries need to do a better job about covering each other's countries and the situation of journalists there.
Okay, we have one more question there. Yeah.
Hi, great session. My question is especially for Sabrina. I think must have been asked to you on numerous occasions, but I'll ask it again. Mohammed Hanif was here the previous 2 days, also mentioned that Pakistan might not be the best place for creative minds and for artists. And especially since you've mentioned that you're a freelance writer and you don't have any institutional protection. As a woman, how much of fire are you under and how do you go about it? What are the unique challenges that you face, not just as a journalist, but as a young woman in journalism?
Well, one thing, what I've learned is it's usually not a good thing to call attention to your gender when you're practicing journalism. But in one sense, I do think because people don't take you very seriously, sometimes you can use patriarchal assumptions to your advantage and move in spaces, maneuver a little bit in areas where you're not expected to go to. But for example, in 2016, the city I was living in, Lahore, it had a massive bombing, and I went to the site, the park where the attack was carried out, and I was really surprised I was the only woman there. There were only male reporters there, and I had like sent an SMS to my friends, my female colleagues, and I said, "Hey, where are you? Why aren't you here?" And they were like, "Our bosses told us to stay in the newsroom and cover something else," and they sent the male reporters. So it's not that women cannot do that work, it's also that institutionally sometimes they're not granted permission to enter those spaces. But one of the privileges I have as a female is actually being able to make those decisions, for better or for worse, myself.
I think just as long as the topic is on women journalists, let's turn to Nepal. If you remember, 2 months ago, there was a photograph of Nepali journalists, editors, exiting the residence of the Prime Minister, and all 13 editors were male, and not one was female. And for a little while, that led to some discussion as to why was it that there were no women there, and could it only be misogyny, or could there be demographic factors in play? Should there be proactive attempts by all sides to bring in more women reporters, editors, desk editors, copy editors? I think that debate, that discussion needs to be taken ahead in Nepal, certainly, only because the topic, your question related to being women and a woman and a journalist. I thought I would put in that little point.
No. I think that is all the time we have for this session. So thank you so much to all our panelists here. And to our lovely audience, I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions of the day. Thank you so much.